Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the second part of the Thriving Lives for Armed Forces Children CPD conference for schools. I'm just going to skip forward. Delegates at this moment in time are muted. You can introduce yourselves in the chat function, which you access through the purple tab at the bottom right hand corner of your screen. We will have a breakout session later on and you'll be able to share video and switch on your microphones for that session. Okay, so we've got a very busy schedule today. You're going to hear very briefly from me. I'm going to remind you of privacy statement because we will be collecting data today. And then I will hand over to Kath, who's going to recap on the toolkit from last week and do a brief overview on Principle 4, transitions are effective. Then Kath will hand over to Moira Leslie, and Moira is going to introduce our speakers for this afternoon, which are Jill Adams from Queen Victoria School. Jill's going to be telling us about how they've turned Principle 2, Wellbeing is supported, into practice. That'll be followed by Scott Sangster from RCET, and Scott's going to tell us about how they operationalise Principle, I think it's 5, listening to young people. And alongside Scott, we've got Peter Rose from Tiller Research today, who's going to be asking the delegates about whether an online survey tool to help you capture the voices of young people from armed forces families would be helpful. And if so, what would that look like? And then finally, our final speaker is Frances Foreman from Education Scotland, and Fran's going to be telling us about how the toolkit can be aligned with HGIOS 4. Then we have some short breakout discussions, and that's an opportunity for the delegates to discuss practice and think about how the toolkit will be used in their own organisation, how it fits and what challenges you might have. And then finally, we've got a Q&A session which will be overseen by Carol McLeod from ADES. Okay, so I'm going to skip over. So just to let you know that I work for the International Centre for Guidance Studies, and we're working with Tiller Research and the Skip Alliance to develop the Thriving Lives Toolkit and other resources further for use in Scotland and Wales. So we will be collecting data during this conference via the poll function and the group chat function, as well as some audio data collected from the breakout discussions. All of the data that we collect today will be treated confidentially, and it will all be used anonymously in compliance with GDPR. So if you do not wish your messages or anything that you contribute in the breakout discussions to be used, that's absolutely fine if you indicate that in the group chat, and we'll make sure it isn't used. Everything that we collect when we use that to write reports for the Skip Alliance, none of that will be attributed to an individual or even an organisation. Okay, if there's any questions that you've got, if you pop those in the group chat, and the team will try and keep an eye on them and answer them as we go along. And you can feel free to use the chat function at all times to share your thoughts with other delegates. Okay, so if I hand over now to Kath Lawrence. Kath, take it away.
Thanks, Jill. I'm going to just kick off today by recapping the 7 principles of effective support, and we'll look quickly at one principle, and then before we go on and hear from lots of experts about their work in support of some of the other principles. As you'll remember from last week, the toolkit uses research by Jill's organisation, ISEGS, and that had 7 principles in it with accompanying vision statements, which lay out what effective support may look like. And here are the 7 principles. They're not hierarchical. Principle 1 might be the starting point, but Principle 7, having well-informed staff, is critical to achieving the other principles. They're all key pieces of the overall jigsaw of what highly effective schools do to support the educational welfare of their service children and young people through their educational journeys. As we saw last week, partners across the UK have worked together to develop from this a training suite to accompany the principles in the toolkit. I hope some of you had time to have a look at that after last week. Let me know in the chat which principles did you choose to explore after last week's session. What were the main messages, the actions you took from it? I'd be really interested to hear that in the chat. So I thought we'd just have a quick look at one of the other principles that we didn't look at in detail last week, Principle 4. which is transition is effective. Systems and support ensure seamless transitions for service children arriving at and leaving schools. And there was a little discussion, I think, before most people arrived earlier about the highest number of moves that people had had. Moira, was it somebody? Could somebody unmute and say who it was? Somebody was saying the most number of moves they'd heard of, which seemed absolutely outstanding.
Yes, it's Moira Leslie here, folks. Every time I worked with youngsters, I would always ask them how many moves, not how many schools, but how many moves they'd actually made. And for a long time, the total was about 17, until I met a young man who had just left school, and he'd said he had 27 moves. And whilst I said it was impossible because he couldn't have that many years in school, he pointed out why and explained very clearly why he had been moved. Sometimes back to the same school several times, but 27 moves in his career. Mind-boggling.
It is, isn't it, Moira? Yes. So this came up quite a lot last week as well, in the chat and in both the breakouts that I was in as well, actually. Many of you have faced challenges, some universal, like supporting young people to adapt and manage friendships, and some kind of different with different age groups. The different school starting age here impacting young children particularly, and then curriculum gaps, misalignment for older year groups, for example. So as you'll remember from last week, the toolkit presents evidence and examples from ISEG's research. On this one, effective schools have a robust supportive transition procedure for students entering and leaving school, particularly at non-standard times. And then on the following page, the users asked to rate themselves as either emerging, reflecting and implementing actions, developing, making strides in addressing the question, but yet to embed it in regular practice and evaluation, or embedding a programme of established, monitored and evaluating work showing evidence of impact. And then on the next page, the toolkit provides those reflection questions which came out of the research. And that's what school leaders can use to, and staff can use to review your own school practice under this principle. You're prompted to consider your current practice, to read the question and think about what evidence do we have in our school, maybe starting off by looking at the middle 3 columns and the judgment as to where you are, and recording any evidence for that judgment. The questions for Principle 4, transition is effective, prompt reflection around identifying service children, working through the long process around a move, and providing a bridge with other schools, both kind of pastorally and also in terms of data, and then right through the process, both academic and pastoral support. So these are on page 20 of your booklet. That's page, it's the purple one, and I think this is page 21 to 22, the questions. So I would like just to give everybody a little bit of time, if you have got your delegate booklet there, just read those questions and reflect a little bit. I hope everyone's comfortable with a little bit of silence because we're going to do that for a minute. Just look at those questions. Does that highlight any gaps or things that you'd like to share that you do really well in this area? We'll give you a couple of minutes. Just put that in the chat. If I go back to the slide before, it shows one of the pages. There we go. So if you have thoughts based on that or experience of transition within your school, do share that in the chat. Would anybody like to unmute and share any thoughts around transition? I know there were quite a few thoughts in the breakouts that I was in last week. Can people unmute themselves, Jill?
They can't, but they can share things in the chat, and if they ask you in the chat, I think I can unmute them. Give them special privilege.
Thank you, Louise. That sounds very, I'd like to know more. That sounds interesting. Resources for transition. Okay, please continue to share things in the chat if you've got any other thoughts. And I will hand over back to Moira. I'll also say that in the delegate booklet, there are spaces for you to reflect in there. I think it's page 33. Again, as we go through today, you might want to turn to page 33, and this is sort of space to reflect on what you've learned today, what actions you might take. I'll hand back to Moira.
Thanks, Kath. Well, I'm going to introduce our presenters now, and Jill has already mentioned two Jills today. Jill H has already mentioned their names, but the presenter today, sorry, I beg your pardon, I should introduce myself properly for those who haven't met me. I'm Education Manager with the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, and I also co-host, co-chair the Skip Alliance Scotland Hub. And I've been involved with Skip Alliance for many years now, and it has been an absolute pleasure to see Skip go from strength to strength and have an ever-increasing visibility and presence in Scotland. So I'm delighted that we're able to do these type of events. Our first presenter, Jill Adams, Deputy Head Teacher of Pupil Support from Queen Victoria School, and as Jill H said, will be addressing Principle 2. But I just wanted to say something before I hand over to Jill, because very often people will say, oh, it's all very well for QVS, it's not like that in state schools. And but I would just like to say that because all of QVS pupils are from armed forces families, everything they do, everything Jill and her team does is focused on the educational well-being of this cohort of learners. And therefore, I think we have a lot, whichever school we're in, I think we can learn an awful lot from what happens in QVS. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jill.
Thank you so much, Moira, and you're very kind. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon and meeting with so many people that I've got such a lot in common with and looking after children from armed forces families. I'm aware that obviously to me, QVS is really familiar, but to other people perhaps it's a bit more of a mystery. So I'm going to start my presentation by telling you a little bit about us. I'm not going to insult you by reading what's on the screen, but I'll talk about us in a little bit more detail. I've been here for the last 23 years, so I know quite a bit about the service community, and I've worked with lots and lots of children and families who've undergone a lot of transitions, coming both into QVS and going out, and sometimes, like Moira said, coming back in again. Our main raison d'etre is to support military families and kind of to stop them from undergoing so many changes in their school career. I think our maximum of pupils joining us in primary 7 is 14 moves, but Moira certainly trumped us this afternoon. But 14 moves by the time you're 11 is still a pretty substantial amount of school moves. And I think if I say that we're there to provide the stability and continuity, all of our children are with us from primary 7 up until the end of S6. And we have a very special set of military traditions that we try and honour at school, bearing in mind the proud traditions of our pupils' families. Our children have either a parent or parents, sometimes both, who either serve in Scotland or who have served in Scotland. And we've got a really diverse and interesting community from all 3 service backgrounds. we're really interested in QVS at looking at these specific challenges of military young people, because all our young people are from a military background. And if a school has enough problem coping with the 10 military children at their school, we've got that times 300. And all of our primary civils are coming in from a really diverse array of places. And hopefully we use the next 7 years to make sure that they leave us to go on to positive destinations with the most support possible. And that's where I think the Thriving Lives Toolkits come in. And I'm so delighted that this has come to Scotland and that we're going to be using it together in the school to look at how we can make the support we provide at QVS even better. I love the resources that are online through Thriving Lives. If you haven't yet had the chance to have a look at them, the graphics from the first part of my presentation here are all taken from the training package. And I definitely think that if you're providing training for your staff, it's something that I'm keen on using with my staff, and it might be something that makes the people in your school understand the unique needs of service children. I think that this slide, which you can read in more detail later, really has the idea that we want to get it right for all children. All our children are service children, but they're all distinct and different, and the toolkit should mean that no one falls through the cracks. We want to listen to pupils' voices to make sure that the support we're putting in place for our military families is right for all of them, or as many of them as possible, and that we're on a journey together to try and make it even better through using some of the evaluative strategies in this toolkit. I love the fact that it's so research-based, and I think that when you're putting policy together, it's really great to be informed and have real research behind some of the policies you're putting in place. And in the training materials, there's so many references to the unique challenges that you can cite and make reference to. And I think some of our staff had never come across some of these statistics or ideas before, even working at QVS. And I think that all schools could maybe benefit from thinking about some of these ideas and thinking about how your school adapts some of these research findings into the way that you look at the young people in your care. I particularly like this and the idea that it's an all-encompassing lifestyle. It's not something that you've chosen, but it's something that maybe the school can benefit from. It shouldn't be seen as something the school has a struggle with, but can be a complement to your school, having a number of armed forces children in your community. We wanted to use the principles to try and get things right with support. And number two, the principle number two, well-being is supported, is the one that appealed to us the most, because we're in the middle of quite an exciting development at the moment in trying to create a well-being space. So it seemed that it was almost like destiny that this toolkit came along at a time when we are looking really closely at well-being. And we're going to use it to map and to strategize how we make this well-being space work. It says tailored pastoral provision supports service children's mental health and well-being, and I think that we used it a lot in our planning of how we could do that. The resources online through the toolkit really gives you a real steer into what you could look at. The magnifying glass is the clue there of all the different ways that you could think about this strand and look at the 5 key questions. And I think when we first came to look at the toolkit, it's one of the things that struck the staff here, how supportive it is and what in-depth provision is there for. You don't have to reinvent the wheel as a leader or a key pastoral lead. It's all there for you, and we certainly found it very, very informative when we were having our initial conversations. It gives you some ideas of really good practice if you want to go into further detail, and we certainly found some of these really interesting ideas about how we could make provision even better. I think that even the graphics, when you're doing staff training, I think that we got people to choose one of the slides and think about how that linked to practice at QVS and how they could start to identify some of the gaps in our practice. And I think that was really informative in making sure that our ongoing plans are really, really strategic. And I think that the summary findings also allow you to reflect on what you're getting right and what your development needs are. And I think in terms of staff training, you couldn't really ask for any better. And the Thriving Lives team have not asked me to say this. I'm a genuine customer, and this is genuinely my response as somebody who's working with this toolkit. I couldn't have found it more user-friendly. As I said, we're looking at Principle 2, Wellbeing, and there were 5 of us. We took one strand each and reflected on what we thought we were doing well within that strand and what we thought we could do a little bit better. And then we came back together after a week apart from one another with some evidence to try and think about where we go next. I think that was a really good and useful approach, and we certainly found it very easy once we all came back together to talk around the 5 strands of this together. And there's a checklist provided for you that you can plug in your information to, your evidence, and what your ensuing actions are going to be. And we really found this so easy to use. I think that obviously one of the criticisms that my team had was, you know, we need it to be an A3 so we can get the amount of things in that we want to do as a result of having looked at this together. So blowing it up was the next step we're going to do, to have a huge version of this, so that in action points we've got even more space to write about the things that we've been prompted to think about as a result of using the toolkit. Our identified next steps are 2. We want to do more training for staff to think about how we put some of these ideas into practice. I want to have even better ways of capturing pupil voice, which is so important if we want to get it right for them. It's all very well us having ideas, but how we get it right for the students has to be informed by them. We're on the cusp of using HGIOS principles, which is the how good is our school from the pupil perspective, and that's the visual on the right. And it was really great to see how well these 2 sets of toolkits align. So I think it will be very easy for our HGIOS group within, you know, Principle 3 to look at the way that our school and community welcomes people in as part of transitions. And I think that they dovetail really nicely in terms of capturing pupil voice. We've got a ready-made group here who have been working with the RCET, working with Nina already, and they are raring to go with this Thriving Lives Toolkit and giving it the going over from a pupil perspective, and that's our next step. The 5 pastoral staff have looked at it now, and now it's going on to the children to give it from their point of view, what they think that we need to focus on. And they're not shy at coming forward, and Nina's there to make sure it's completely objective. I'm not part of this consultation. They do it out with me, and then we all come together to talk about their findings. And it's a really great conversation, and the students absolutely love it. These are some of the ways that we are thinking about making sure that the Thriving Lives Toolkit is representative across the school. These are some of our already existing mouthpieces. We've got the POD group, which is our Parents on Deployment group. We've got an Equality and Diversity group emerging this year. And on the bottom left, that's them at the Arches in Glasgow. Those are our mental health champions. And they're going to be quite strict in making sure that the wellbeing space that we create matches up to what the students want and how they think it will meet their needs. And some of the evaluative questions in the toolkit really will make sure that that is represented. The 2 questions at the end, 2.4 and 2.5, are the 2 that are going over to pupils to make sure that their evidence and their actions become part of the consultation. And we're really looking forward to hear from them in August. That's going to be the first thing they do when they come back. One of their major driving forces is to try and ensure that pupil voice informs, and using innovative digital practices such as we first came up with in lockdown has been brilliant. Doing surveys and making posters, sharing and editing has been great suite, and has really allowed us to capture real live opinion and create a lot of discussion and debate. We also worked with the UK Ambassador for Happiness, who's called Action Jackson, and he is really supporting our learners to think about what they say yes to and how they can be empowered to have a say in what makes school good for them. If anyone's come across him or not, I really recommend him. He's a tonic, and he really empowered our students to feel confident to speak up about what they wanted to see in school in terms of support, particularly for the unique nature of our school. He was absolutely fantastic. We've got 4 key things that we want to do following on from our consultation. We want to develop a pupil leadership team. We want to create a bespoke wellbeing space. Our students have called it the lighthouse. They want it to be the place that guides you through the sort of stormy seas of life. We want to build capacity in our teachers to really understand the military community, because just because people work in a school with military children, if you've got a changing workforce, you need to make sure that everybody understands what on-deployment means and how that affects young people here. And we want to continue to use the digital adaptations that we started in lockdown to really capture voice and make sure that young people continue to have a say in the way we move forwards. The Lighthouse logo is on the left. I hope that the Thriving Lives Toolkit is really the thing that makes sure the Lighthouse is designed with pupils at the heart of it, and that all the toolkit gives us is real and accurate recording of the pupils' wishes so that we can evaluate the impact on them, not just what we think they want as children, but what they bring forward and what they prioritise. And to see the impact on them has really been fantastic. They have definitely felt much more empowered as a result of looking at this toolkit, and I can't wait to use it more in some of the other areas to see the impact on students' wellbeing at QVS. And I'll be happy to talk about that in the breakout space once we're finished. Thank you so much for inviting me, Moira, and I'm really excited to see where the toolkit takes us.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you. It's great to hear how Thriving Lives and QVS are getting along so well, and I look forward to the future developments. I'm sure you will have raised lots of questions, which I hope people will pop into the chat function or address during the breakout discussions. But really fantastic presentation, Jill, and thank you so much indeed. And good luck for the future developments. And hopefully I can come and visit the Lighthouse space in the not too distant future. Thank you. I'd like to hand over now to Scott Sangster, who is RCT Youth Participation Project Worker for Highland and for Moray. Scott is going to address Principle 5, Children Are Heard, and fingers crossed, hopefully he's going to be joined by one of the young people that he is working with in Highland and Moray. And this is a bargain because you get two for the price of one in this presentation, because Scott is going to be joined by Peter Rose, and Peter is Director of Tiller Research, as you've heard. Tiller Research is an independent social impact research company currently working with SCIP Alliance to develop the practical tools that schools can use to support the use of the Thriving Lives Toolkit. Peter will, after Scott's presentation, Peter will outline a proposed online survey tool that will support schools with their work and listening to the voices of armed forces children and young people, and also with the efforts to engage with the parents as well. So Scott, may I hand over to you first?
Thank you very much, Moira. Yes, as Moira said there, I am slowly watching the chat there to see if a young person is going to arrive straight from school to jump on and support this process as well. So thank you for taking the time to hear us out. My name is Scott Sangster. I am the Youth Participation Project Worker covering Highlands and Moray. And as was mentioned there beforehand, my manager, Nina Collins, covers the central area. Obviously, it was highlighted in Jill's slides there. We work to hear and gather the pupil voice, and we've been doing so. This presentation is taken as a snapshot, whistle-stop tour of some of the work that's been done over the last year to ensure that we're still gathering those voices, and some of our practices informed directly by the views of the young people that we're working with. And I would like to thank the schools that have supported that process, that have enabled us in what has been a very challenging year for all of us digitally to engage with those children and young people, and for teachers to be able to find that time to be able to reach out and have the support coming in, even if it was, as you saw on that slide with Jill there, virtually zooming into classrooms or teaming into classrooms, or whichever mechanism or platform we can use to be able to engage and have those conversations with children and young people. So without any further ado, I have highlighted a few principles that have guided our way forward. We are looking at the toolkit, and we considered Principle 5, which is to ensure that diverse voices are heard and inform the support they receive. We've also recognised that UNCRC Article 12 has just been passed as a bill in Scotland to be able to ensure that children's experiences are heard on issues that affect them. That underpins some of our work, and I will go through each of those points and just try and highlight some of the work that we do to recognise where the views of young people actually inform our work, and inform the work within schools as well. To what extent are service children represented in schools and other forums? Within RCET, we have a few tier structure. Basically, we have co-production projects that we run with our young people. Our current membership is around about 30 to 40 young people from armed forces families, representing tri-services. So that comes from the Central Belt up into Highlands and Moray, from different services and different experiences along the way. And the gathering those voices enables us to reach out further and get a better perspective of what support services would benefit our armed forces children and young people. Our Your Mind Matters project is a digital tool that they recognise would be able to help them in accessing support with health and well-being, and this last year has been no change to that, where the challenges of connectivity and isolation may be affecting the support that children and young people from armed forces families can get. And a Forces Life board game is another co-production project that we have, which is obviously a board game looking at a concept of snakes and ladders, where sometimes we climb the ladder, sometimes the effects of being part of a Forces families may make us fall, and we have to pick ourselves back up again. Recognizing these and being able to put statements alongside this game is going to raise awareness amongst all participants of the school life to identify some of the challenges that children and young people of armed forces families experience. Conferences and school activity, we continually work with young people to hear their experiences, to enable them to talk more readily about what they want to see happening. The likes of our conferences, the likes of the board game, these are all ideas that they came forward with that we move forward. So it's hand in hand. We work alongside young people, not for young people or to young people. It's something that they lead the way on, and we are there to support. As Jill highlighted before, those conversations are quite robust, quite insightful, and obviously their voices make the difference to the services that they receive. National Military Youth Voice, you can see that two of our young participants there are wearing their hoodies that they designed themselves. And again, through lockdown was a nice gift that they received to give them that sense of belonging and shared identity amongst each of them. Local forums, Highlands and Moray, we have regular contact with them. Again, this has been highlighted as a positive for them, even if it has been on Zoom and they haven't been able to engage face to face. They've also had the opportunity to connect regularly with each other, have a routine in their week, and be able to share some of the insights that are going on for them in their time, in their space, whilst over the last year there have been those challenges. In so doing, recognising the schools that have high concentrations of young people within their areas, there have been schools that have come forward and opened those doors, and it's been great. Some of the young people have seen then opportunities where they recognize. And again, the Thriving Lives Toolkit does point to some best practice, looking at buddies, whether mentors, whether young people that act as peer support, and action groups within schools where they can come together and feel that, again, sense of belonging. One of the transition projects that we did was to look at, I'm going to skip that slide. I've highlighted there the Cooking for Excellence. Again, that just enables, we recognise that because that's obviously part of Scottish schools at the moment, and I have highlighted in blue there, through contributing my views, time and talents, I play a part in bringing about positive change in my school and wider community, underpinning some of the views that young people have. I think the benefits of recognising this, working alongside young people, the confidence grows, and that, again, sense of belonging and the difference and change that they can make has to come from them. And they recognise that and actually identify with the benefits and the changes they feel as being totally part of that. With regards to transitions, buddies, as I mentioned before there, has emerged as one of the topics that young people would like to try and support, peer support within schools, having action groups, having groups that are identified where there's lunch clubs and things like that. Some of our young people recognise there's also transition from primary to secondary, which over the last year has obviously posed a few challenges in being able to get those school visits, to be able to have the views around the school, and to enable that transition to go smoothly just from primary to secondary. So in order to look at how best they could support as buddies, some of our young people did a Q&A session with their younger peers transitioning from Rigmore Primary School up into Milburn. and we had to do so over using digital tools, be it Jamboards on this occasion, but that was supported again by teachers in schools being able to offer that live moment of seeing what their responses would be. What if teachers don't understand what it's like to be from a forces family? The teachers that were in the room with us at that point clearly said that they were there to help, talked about some of the things that they can do, and then our young participants of Military Youth Voice took that a step further and were able to coordinate a way of being able to, outside classroom, answer those questions face to face, both boosting the confidence of the young people that were standing presenting to the children from the primary school, and for the primary to recognise that there are buddies that they can see a familiar face as they transition up into secondary. This in turn had a bit of a ripple effect to it, in as much as the nurseries and the primary did the same thing as a peer-to-peer support structure that's there, and I think that all builds the support of a wider community around them. Again, these are shared through the support of being part of the military liaison group in Highland. I can see that Lou is online with us as well right now, which again has been pivotal in the support that we are able to contribute to, as the toolkit will hopefully enable all of us to be able to contribute to the same way forward. Adapting online to engage with young people, as Jill highlighted in the last slide, in the last presentation there, we have had to adapt. We've had to be able to virtually Zoom into schools, have those connections and conversations. It does enable two parts to it. One, that we still gather the views of young people directly using Jamboards. They write up their sticky notelets and they let us know how they feel about certain things over the last year. And you can see on there that Zoom has made a difference in providing that regularity. They do feel hard and they want to feel hard. So there's a number of different projects that are in there. They want to play their part. So again, each of our young people, as we move forward, we co-produce. That co-production project isn't something that we come to them with the ideas. Great, Grace has joined us. As a mapping exercise, we need to know where we're going. Young people need to know where they're going. That sense of belonging amongst the group there enables them to start growing, more so as a team than maybe as a group, but they do recognise where the support can come in. You can see some of the notelets that they've put up there with regards to how they can gain support from within schools. And again, the toolkit is one of those ways that we can all work together to ensure that our children and young people of forces families are heard. I am going to let you hear a short audio clip, and then as you come back from that, we also have a young person that has joined us. We've got a young person that joined us from our Military Youth Voice forum, who is going to share. I posed a question to her, which I'll elaborate on after we hear the audio file.
Okay, just bear with me. Hopefully this will work. And of course it's
Thank you, Jill.
Why is it not working, Scott? It did work in our practice. No.
As was highlighted before, it was actually touched.
Let me just try that again. Apologies.
We have.
Let me try it again.
We can adapt. We can. Jill, honestly, we have the real thing with this, and so to save any time there. Our young people, as highlighted in the QBS slide there, our young people do recognise some of the opportunities that schools create, and obviously, as was highlighted at the start of this session, some of the moves that they go between schools, move to different areas through deployment. Some of the best practice comes from our children and young people, and the audio clip, unfortunately, maybe you can get it there after the presentation, but we're talking about pods, which Jill also highlighted, and just ways of supporting our children and young people within schools and within transition to have familiar faces and places they can go to when they need that additional support. As I mentioned before, we have a young person with us, and I posed the question to Grace, who's very kindly rushed from her school back to us and joined us online. I asked the question what benefits the toolkit would make towards her. So if Grace is willing and able and with us right now, Grace, would you be able to answer?
Let me just check. She should be set up properly. Yeah, her microphone is on. Can you hear us, Grace? Oh, she disappeared as well. Well, this is going brilliantly, isn't it?
Again, the toolkit will enable those opportunities for us all to be able to join up, possibly in the future face-to-face. These are the challenges we face right now when we're online. Technology is great when it works for us. Take a few moments and just see if Grace is available. It would be nice to be here, to be able to hear views from our young people.
Grace, can you turn your camera on or your microphone on? She's reconnecting at the moment. It's maybe just
Right.
her internet's a bit shaky.
Okay.
While we're waiting to see if Grace can get fixed up, may I just add to what Scott has said, the transition project, because schools, if not all schools, will have fabulous transition policies in place and practice in place, but I haven't come across many schools where they came from the children themselves, and the answers came from the children themselves, a real peer-to-peer support transition. And it threw up different questions. I mean, we as teachers always think we're doing the best for the transitions for the youngsters, but until you actually ask them themselves, you don't know what their questions are. And as Scott mentioned, we replicated the P7S1 exercise with the early years preschool to primary one, and one of the major questions from the preschool pupils was, will we be allowed to play? But I love this one. One little girl said, will I still be allowed to dance when I go to primary one? So the primary ones have actually just this week created a video. I haven't actually watched it myself yet, but they've produced a video of the primary one responses to the preschool children's questions.
Hi, Grace.
Oh,
I think Grace is with us now.
She is with us, but Grace, you need. There you go. You've got your microphone on. Hi, Grace.
Hi.
There we go. You can also turn your video on if you want to.
Thank you, Grace, for coming along.
So hi, I'm Grace, and I'm currently involved in obviously Military Youth Voice, the Scotland Forum. And I just think it's important that military youth are understood, just so we can be helped with the struggles. Sometimes we just want a chat with a teacher that actually understands the terminology we used, and how difficult it is to have a loved one serving in the military. We only just want maybe a quick conversation or someone who actually understands military life, just so we know support is out there if we need it. And I think even though everyone's experience having a loved one who's serving in the military is different, I think we can all agree we just want support, and it would just make our school life and just life in general a little bit better.
Grace, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the challenges that you just went through in the last half an hour, I would imagine. But thank you very much for coming along. You're absolutely right. The better we can coordinate support for children and young people of armed forces families, the better it'll be for you guys. Again, thank you again for coming along. My details are there. Please get in touch. We look forward to the opportunity to be able to work together and collaborate. And I am going to pass on to Peter from Taylor Research now.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, so my name's Peter Rose, and as Moira said earlier, I'm an independent researcher currently working with the Skip Alliance to develop some practical tools that schools can use to support and enhance their use of the Thriving Lives Toolkit. As Scott discussed in his presentation, Principle 5 of the toolkit is Children Are Heard, and thank you very much to Scott for highlighting some of the key considerations around this, and also for sharing some real practical examples of how this can be done effectively. Following on from Scott's presentation, one of the things that the Skip Alliance has been asked for by some of the schools who have been using the Thriving Lives Toolkit is some advice and guidance on what sorts of questions to ask armed forces children and young people and their families, and also to have some guidance on the best process for how to ask these questions and, I guess, analyse the responses in order to maximise the engagement of families and of children and young people, to help build a positive relationship between the schools and their armed forces families, but also to make sure that there's useful insight gained that can actually be used to make a positive practical difference within the school community. So one of the proposed solutions for this is an online survey tool. The idea is that this would be a practical tool that would sit alongside an online version of the Thriving Lives Toolkit that is currently under development. So it's not to kind of add more dimensions. It's really a tool, you know, to help schools with their exploration of the toolkit. The idea that we're working on at the moment is that the survey tool would have lots of different sets of questions. So sets of questions on different aspects covered by the toolkits, so that schools can build a survey or a set of surveys that focuses on sort of their current priority areas. So whether that be about looking at some of the specific principles within the toolkit, and you know, also to be customizable based on you know, other considerations around the current circumstances of the school, or things that they are particularly interested in looking at. So the idea is that, yes, the tool from a kind of practical point of view would directly support the principle 5 of the toolkit, children are heard, and also principle 6 around engagement with parents, or engagement of parents. But actually it would be a tool that schools could use to evaluate their progress in relation to the toolkit overall, by ensuring that the opinions of armed forces children, young people and their families you know, are sought on issues related to other principles within the toolkit, if not, you know, the full range of principles. At the moment, we're in the early stages of scoping out the content for this online survey tool. And what we want to do at this initial stage is to identify how best to shape both the content of the questions, but also the functions of the tool, so that they'll be most useful, you know, actually for schools. So as part of this, I've got 3 questions that I would like to ask you. So the first question is a poll question to start with. So what I'd like to ask everybody is to what extent do you agree or disagree that an online survey tool would help your school to develop a more effective approach to hearing the voices of armed forces children and young people. Now, we're going to have a poll here with 5 options. If you feel that this question isn't relevant to you, or you don't know the answer, just don't click anything. So if I launch that poll, hopefully everybody can see that. So if I could just ask everybody to give the response to that first question there. Okay, and thank you very much. And then my second question, to what extent do you agree or disagree that an online survey tool would help your school to develop a more effective approach to engaging armed forces parents or families? I'll just give everybody a moment to give you a response to that one. Excellent, thank you very much. And then sort of a final question to really reflect upon, really, just thinking about a tool such as this. Just, you know, don't worry about what might feel realistic or not. Just think about what features or capabilities of an online survey tool like this, if anything, would you find most useful? And any thoughts that you've got on that, if you could add your thoughts to the chat box on the right. Or it may be that with some of the breakout sessions later and some of the topics on that you might have some other ideas that you'd like to mention there and discuss with other delegates. And then just finally from me, as part of this process, we are looking to identify schools and other stakeholders who are working with schools who would be willing to take part in either an in-depth interview or a group discussion about your experiences and challenges in relation to engaging armed forces parents, children and young people. And then to discuss a bit about how an online survey tool could be best designed to offer opportunities to support and enhance your practice in this area. If you would be interested in participating in this, that'd be fantastic. If you are, either drop a message in the chat or you can drop a comment onto the conference evaluation form that I'm sure will be highlighted a few times before we finish today. So thank you very much everybody for your contributions. Do feel free to add any more thoughts on this that you have either into the chat, you know, later on in today's sessions. But for now, I shall hand you back to, I think it's Jill, who is going to be introducing the breakout sessions.
Yes, I'll give delegates 5 minutes of reflection time, just to think about what they've heard about the 2 different principles, and if they want to reflect more on a survey tool and what that might look like for them. So you've got 5 minutes, and then we're going to hear from Fran Foreman, so I'll be handing back to Moira in 5 minutes. Okay, so that's our reflection time. I hope everyone's had a chance to think about what they've learned today and how they might use that. And now I'll hand back to Moira.
Thank you, Jill, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Fran Foreman. Fran is a Senior Education Officer with Education Scotland, and Fran is going to look at how Thriving Lives Toolkit can align with and complement our Scottish Self-Evaluation Toolkit of HGIOS 4. So over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much indeed, Moira. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. You can.
That's great. Sorry, just had a funny thing come up at my screen. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I work quite closely with Moira and also with Carolyn, and it's great to have this chance to speak with you and to hear actually all the other presentations as well. That's been really helpful. I'm just really going to go through a short presentation looking at HGIOS 4, how good is our school 4, and obviously kind of not comparing it, but seeing how that matches in really well with the Thriving Lives Toolkit. Just to give you a little bit of kind of background, as Moira said, I'm a Senior Education Officer and I work within the national team for inclusion, wellbeing and equalities within Education Scotland. As part of my national remit, I have supporting children and young people from the armed forces families. I am myself a child from the armed forces. All my siblings were, so this is a world I'm very familiar with and I'm very passionate about as well. But all the work that we do, and actually everything that's been spoken about today, it all sits within our context for Scottish education, and inclusion for all our learners is the cornerstone of Scottish education. Actually, inclusion is the only legislative area of education in Scotland, but you can see on this slide here, this really is just a simple overview of how the range of our policies and drivers and legislation and professional support, for example, through GTCS or SSSC, or the CLD standards, how they all fit in. Around curriculum for excellence, the refresh of curriculum for excellence, and clearly the wellbeing indicators as well. And I've got 3 policy drivers there, just for this particular slide. The UNCRC, which has been mentioned a number of times today, which has been really great to hear. The Additional Support for Learning Action Plan, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a really important piece of work that's being undertaken at the moment, looking at how all our learners are supported, including those from armed forces families, and the promise. And what we've got here in grey, and again it relates to everything that's been mentioned, are these rights and participation of our learners, how important relationships are, that they underpin everything, inclusion and universal support, and really importantly well-being and care. So this is the context in which within education in Scotland we all work within. And you'll be familiar obviously with how good is our school 4. I think when that first was published, I've said before, and I realise I might sound a little bit maybe a bit nerdy about it by saying it, but I genuinely got incredibly excited about this self-reflection tool because it has inclusion embedded throughout it, and we haven't had that in previous self-evaluation, really similar to the Thriving Lives Toolkit. And we do work within Scottish education looking at improvement, self-evaluation, and this really is the go-to manual in which all schools and early years, obviously they have a how good is our early years version, are using. And it was really great to hear Jill talk about the how good is our school. That is obviously for originally our young leaders of learners, our young inspectors it was originally called, but it's my colleague Maxine Jolly who leads on that, and also leads on the UNCRC. So we can't look at any area of education without looking at how are our learners of all ages giving those opportunities to participate. The virtuous cycle of improvement, again, this is within HGIOS 4, but we're looking at sharing really good practice, sharing what I described actually at the beginning, our sort of national drivers, our aims and our goals. And inclusion in Scotland is our national driver. But it's informed by research, and what I always particularly like about the toolkit is that basis of research, and that it will empower learners and practitioners and the wider school community. And it can be adapted for your local context. When I was a local authority officer, we had a reserve base in the local authority, and it probably would be fair to say that not probably very many people were aware of that, and therefore weren't aware that they had children in their school community that were from armed forces family, whether that's reserve actually or regular. So the context in which we will operate is really important, and HGIOS 4 enables you to adapt to that context, as does the Thriving Lives Toolkit. The 3 themes that we have, within HGIOS 4, looking at leadership and management, the learning provision, successes and achievements. You can map these really well to all of the principles, and we heard from Kath and Jill in particular, looking at principle 4, principle 5. Again, what I kind of said earlier on, I got really excited about HGIOS 4 because it's much easier to map things across to it. At the bottom of this slide, I've got all in the circle, I've got all of the principles, again, trying to kind of prove that point. What we have to be really careful of, though, is what we don't want to do is keep sort of republishing, if you like, different versions of HGIOS 4. There's a real temptation to do a HGIOS 4 for, you could have one example for armed forces families. We did that quite a lot with HGIOS 3, and we have tried to avoid doing that as much as possible, because this one should be it is much more flexible. So when you go down all the quality indicators, you can see, particularly when you look in further detail of them within HGIOS 4, how each principle is relevant to the quality indicators. And what I thought would be helpful to look at is, given that example of principle 4 in the Thriving Lives Toolkit of transitions. We have 2.6 within our HGIOS 4 in the theme of transitions. You won't be able to see all of this text, and certainly it's not my intention to read it all through, but when you look at the illustrations, the examples of what we would consider to be good, highly effective practice, what we've heard today already are those very examples. And what's important is the challenge questions, because we are on that continuous cycle of improvement. And again, really similar to the reflection questions within the toolkit. Here you can see the challenge questions in a little bit more detail, but when you compare these 2 different, if you like, toolkits, these 2 different resources, the commonality, I've drawn them out on the right hand side here. They are reflective resources. There's supporting positive relationships, really, really important. They're supporting that learner and participation. And actually they should be supporting staff participation across the board, leadership at all levels. Really important is that information sharing. We are really aware of the complexity and the difficulties that there are in sharing information between the devolved nations for our learners, if they're coming in from a devolved nation. Within Scotland, that is a little bit easier because we have CMIS, but it can be more complicated, obviously, when we're looking at families perhaps moving in from abroad or from England, for example. that's really similar to any family moving in from abroad. But obviously, with children with armed forces families, there are some additional factors we need to have cognizance of. There are challenges with the curriculums, you know, the differences in the curriculum, the stages, the choice, availability of subjects once you get into second year. You know, we're really familiar with that. So, and I've skipped and I've missed out well-being because, you know, really fundamental to everything, as well as the relationships, is the well-being of our learners and our families. Achievement and attainment, you know, again, the reflective questions in HGIOS 4 and, you know, within the toolkit helps you to kind of tease out that kind of questions. How do we know we're doing well? What's our evidence for saying, yeah, we're okay at that, we're doing quite well at that, we think we're quite fine at that? We have to be able to triangulate our evidence to demonstrate our improvement and to demonstrate, I suppose, where you are in that journey. And really importantly on here, you know, that triangulation of data is valid, it's crucial, is when we're supporting our learners. Do you know in a school who your learners are? And I know that might sound quite trite, but, you know, do you know, for example, who may require additional support for whatever reason? And obviously our learners from armed forces families, they are covered by the Additional Support for Learning Act. That can be quite a challenge for families coming and moving in, because our education system, very inclusive, needs-led, not diagnostic-led. And for some families, they may be quite taken aback to discover that actually their child is being considered to have additional support needs. And some, you know, they may need some support in understanding what that actually means in the Scottish context, because they would be more used to terminology like special educational needs, which is very different from what we use in Scotland. We don't use that terminology. And professional learning, really important, because if we're going to be able to support our learners and our families and our staff, there will be times where our staff need and benefit from some reflection and some professional learning. I'm not sure if it's a good time or not to say, but Carolyn, Moira and myself, we've been working on a professional learning activity that will be definitely available by the time schools go back. And another tool that you may not be familiar with, but is actually based on HGIOS 4, is our Getting It Right for All learners. Again, it was great to see in Jill's presentation, you know, she was making reference to the Getting It Right for Every Child approach. This resource it does very much, again, link to the toolkit. And it's quite a short resource actually, but it's helping to hone in on these 3 areas of leadership, curriculum, learning, teaching and assessment, underpinned by well-being, learning and collaboration, all really important for our children and young people from armed forces families. So just wanted to highlight that to you. I'm giving you an absolute whistle-stop tour. And again, as I mentioned, you know, you can see these links because this graphic on the left-hand side, you know, these are all phrases, if you like, they're all terms taken from HGIOS 4. And you can see inclusion, well-being, equality and equity, mapping really well with those 7 principles within the Thriving Lives Toolkit, and drawing out those reflective questions. So I think this, you know, as we've already seen today, this could be a tool which could be really helpful for schools to use, whether they're downloading it or whether they're looking at it on the website, and to support those discussions at all levels within the school, and to support the learner participation. Ultimately, what we all want to do is improve the educational experiences and the outcomes of our learners from armed forces families. And I do think that this tool really helps us along that journey to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. May I come in and just say that not for one moment have I envied my school colleagues over these COVID challenging times, but having heard the presentations this afternoon, I actually feel quite excited about the prospect of, I wish I had a school to go and implement all these initiatives, but thank you for all the presentations, and I'm going to hand it back to Jill, who's going to introduce the breakout rooms for you. And could I ask, during your breakout discussions, could each of the breakout rooms formulate at least one question to kick off our question and answer session? Thank you.
Thank you, Moira. Okay, so we now have 20 minutes. I'm going to pop you all into breakout rooms in a moment. And it's an opportunity for people, not just in schools, but in other organisations that might be involved, to think about how you might use the Thriving Lives Toolkit. I'd also like you to think about if it needs any tweaks or improvements, amendments or updates, or could be improved or developed further for use in Scotland, because obviously there are terminology differences and there are policy differences and different contextual differences for schools operating in Scotland compared to the other developed nations. And then finally, if you are going to implement the toolkit or use it in some way, what might be your main challenges, and what other resources or other supports might help you to implement the 7 different principles? Okay, so if you bear with me for one moment, I'm going to put you into breakout groups, and you have got 20 minutes.
For the main group, please. I think that was Rosie. I'll start with you. Could you pose the question that your group developed, please?
I can. I think we've maybe had 3 questions. So we had, I'll maybe just summarise them and then we'll see where we go. So would schools might like more work on the links between HGIOS 4 and the Thriving Lives Toolkit? That was a question. how we go about sharing best practice. We had some discussion about that, and we maybe answered our own question in the session, and something about how we best engage schools, including those schools who might not. Well, we recognise that some schools would naturally be more engaged maybe than others. So how do we reach the schools that are maybe less likely to be engaged? So maybe two main questions: how to engage schools, and would schools like more work on HGIOS 4, and the links to the toolkit.
Thank you, Rosie. I think those questions reflected a group that did not have schools represented, so we certainly wanted to hear from schools. Is there someone that would like to respond to that? Just wondering if I can check any hands up. No? Okay.
Jill.
Oh, Jill, have you got your hand up? Jill Adams, yes, thank you.
Yes, I do. I just thought I'd reply as a school, and I think that, you know, we're just embarking on our journey with the toolkit, and it's very much a first steps on one of the, you know, principles. And I think I'd very much like to see more opportunities to collaborate with other schools who've maybe looked at, you know, other principles, and also how schools are anchoring it with HGIOS 4. I'm really interested in HGIOS, you know, the young people's perspective, and I can see clear links. I'd love to work with somebody else in the group who's interested in thinking about pairing up with me or trioing up with me to look at how we map that even on a journey together. I think that'd be really interesting, and I'd be happy to come back and talk about that at a later date. I'd love to do it with other people who would also be interested.
Great. Jill, I think that's an excellent suggestion, because I think one of the key points that was suggested was that professional development and that journey that as educators we are all continuing along. So that sharing ideas and having voices from different schools would be absolutely useful and informative. So I'm sure someone will take you up on that as we go forward. Jump for that. Yeah, super. Okay. That's great. Are there any other comments about collaboration and working together as we use the toolkit in Scotland? Peter, did you want to? No?
Oh,
sorry. You just appeared on my screen, so I asked you.
Poor you. No, I mean, I guess, I mean, one thought that I had leading on from what Jill said, and actually, you know, that was part of the conversation in our room, is whether or not, you know, or a kind of question about what might or how might schools be supported to find that peer support, and it, you know, it feels as though from some of the conversations that maybe yes, there's a lot of serendipity about finding a good match or finding that peer support. And I didn't know whether you know, anybody had maybe some thoughts on how that could become maybe a more ordered or structured process rather than sort of just relying on serendipity.
Thank you, Rosa. Peter, I think that is important, rather than just expecting something to happen, but actually facilitating that. And I think we certainly have people who are exchanging emails and contact already, so that's positive. Thank you. Lindsay, you had your hand up. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, it was just to kind of reiterate what Jill was speaking about there. We spoke about in our breakout room about coming together and looking through the toolkit and HGIOS 4 and sharing experiences, because I think that's one of the most valuable things. The toolkit looks very good, really exciting to start moving down that process, but maybe kind of thrashing out different challenges that schools face might be quite beneficial in an ongoing process. I think because this is not probably going to be like it's plain sailing all the way through. I think there'll be certain challenges that come up with different aspects of the principles along with HGIOS 4, and not repeating the process or repeating the kind of similar questions that are asked. in the self-evaluation process. So yeah, I think that will all be very beneficial.
Good. Thank you, Lindsay. I think what I'm hearing is the added benefit of not working in isolation, but actually joining up across schools and perhaps even across RICs or local authorities to find out what others are doing so that you can enhance your own professional learning. Good. Thank you. That sounds great. I wonder if we have a question from the second group. I'm not sure who was leading that. Jill?
Take this one. We had two questions. The first was about, this is obviously a very important piece of work, and it's obviously something that many schools will be involved in and want to spend time on. But in order for them to be able to do that effectively, how will that be funded? How will that be resourced? Because a lot of the links in schools at the moment are doing this and it's not funded. So that's an extra pressure on them at a time when they're already working beyond capacity to some extent. So how can we convince the government to give them funding?
An interesting question, and I will ask if anyone has any thoughts on that. Fran?
I'll just come in. Yeah.
We're looking at you. Thank you.
I'm glad you can't see me. Obviously, the funding situation in Scotland is different to England. Local authorities are provided funding. We do not tell local authorities how to use that funding. There is a lot of flexibility for local authorities. You know, it's very devolved in that regard. It is not common for us to be ring fencing funding. There's very few examples of ring-fenced funding, so it's probably not the answer that you want to hear, and it's not for me to say do not contact colleagues at SG. You know, Moira, myself, and Caroline sit on the national government group for supporting armed forces children. I do not anticipate that there would be specific funding for this, but there may be other funding from the government, there may be other funding routes in which you could explore and which have been explored. I'm thinking of the MOD funding, you know, sort of in the past. One of the I suppose, a good thing about highlighting the benefits and those links, and I was saying in the group of the slide that I showed you, is that you can weave this into daily jobs, so to your daily work, so it doesn't feel like so much as an add-on. I know that might sound a little bit trite, but you know, when you're looking at relationships and you're looking at, you know, supporting well-being, we're doing that anyway. And making that those good links that are already in HGIOS and that's already in the toolkit is sort of a natural way forward. But this has been an unprecedented 15 months. I don't have to tell you that. And you know, and people are exhausted. I think that would be fair to say, and I can totally understand how you would want, you know, people say, well, we need a resource for this. It's not the answer you want, I know.
But thank you. I think that's helpful for us to have that response and that starting point. Thank you. Moira, would you like to add something, please?
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Fran, for that honest answer, because I mean it is always useful to get a straightforward, honest answer. And you've highlighted the role of the local authorities in relation to funding. And I think one of the things that we need to do, I think we should be doing, is actually making sure that this is kept on the agenda of the Scottish Government. It's kept on the agenda, and I'm sure, Caroline, you're doing that anyway, I know you are, on the local authorities agenda, so it's a priority, and you know, one of many priorities, a priority, and not, and you're right, Fran, not a sort of also ran, it's something it can be central to support, and you know, a lot of the reflective questions in the toolkit are very useful anyway for all children, but I think it's important for those of us who can to keep it on the agenda, to try and keep it high on the agenda of Scottish Government and local authority.
Thank you, Moira. Louise, would you like to comment?
Yeah, just really on the back of what, oops, I'm trying to learn how to share my video. I thought I'd sussed that one. Just on the back of what Moira was saying and Fran was saying, is I think that's, I suppose in Highland where we're lucky and there is funding, my role is funded, and the MLG. So within the MLG, we are producing resources that will support, I think, the toolkit with the questions that it's asking. Would you agree, Moira, that there are resources? Yeah, so we have that facility through the funding to develop these resources that support the toolkit that will help the schools and will help the children and young people. I'm not sure, what do you think, Moira?
Absolutely agree. I mean, there's and as Caroline mentioned earlier, we don't want to be looking to creating new networks. We need to use the facilities and the networks that we already have. Caroline's networks, the Military Liaison Group in Highland and others. So I think we need to capitalise on what we've got and utilise what we've got, because we've got some excellent networks, available to us to pursue this work and to further this work.
It is sounding as if there is an appetite and an interest to create a message that could be circulated across Scotland that will enhance the work that's already being done and probably whet the appetite for others to find out a little bit more. So that might be something to take forward as an action. Jill, you mentioned that you had 2 questions. Could you pose the second question from your group?
Yeah, it was actually something that Louise brought up, thinking about how to, in fact, it's probably better if I let Louise phrase the question, but it was to do with resources that have been developed and how schools could actually end up using them. But then, Louise, can you explain?
Yeah, no, so I suppose that goes on from what I've just said just now. So as Moira is well aware of some of the resources that are in production at the moment, then they've not reached their final stage. We're getting them towards their final stage, but we know those resources would be probably, I think, really helpful for other authorities across Scotland. However, we obviously want to keep ownership, but we're willing to share, and it's what that looks like, that and how we can add value to them and share and add value, and think about how can we share those with other authorities once they go live. And it would be great to be able to have discussion around them about thoughts. What do you think? Do you think this is workable? How does this fit with the toolkit? I'm not sure. It's just this whole session today has sparked so many questions about how we can work more collaboratively across authorities with sharing resources, supporting each other, and yeah, it's sparked. So yeah, we have resources in Highland which we have ownership of. However, I am sure we would be willing to share them with our sort of stamp on it, as it were. And how do we go about that, and how can we sort of look at how they fit and would support the toolkit, I suppose, is what I'm saying, potentially. And I know Moira's about to say something because I can see her looking for her mute button.
I was only about to say, Lou, your time's up.
I'm off. And actually, apologies, I am actually going to have to go in about 2 minutes. So I'm saying goodbye to everybody now and thank you.
Thanks.
I would like to, again, I think, just reiterate that we have a number of networks already in place in Scotland and communication channels. And I think what we need to do is take a look at how best to, or how to use those better, perhaps, and how to highlight on that. So I think there could be further discussions that proceed. I'm looking at the time. I know we've just got another minute or so left, but I wonder if there was a group 3, if they had a question. I don't want us to forget you. Was there another group that met? No, Jill's shaking her head. So there were just the 2. Well, then I think we finished at quite a good time. And I would like to hand back, unless are there any other comments, I'm going to hand back to Moira to wrap up the session for us. Thank you. Okay, Moira?
Thank you, Caroline. Just a few very, very brief thank yous. The first one is to ISEG's team and especially to Jill for today for setting up and managing the technical side of things. It's always very helpful when you don't have to, well, me personally doesn't have to press any buttons or anything. So a huge thank you to the ISEG's team, and I hope it's been useful in your process of data collection. I also want to thank the Skip Alliance community, and I say the community because it really is a huge community, but in particular to Phil and to, I know Phil wasn't here today, and Kath, to you, Kath, a huge thank you for making us work and just bringing us to Scotland. I also wanted to say a huge thank you to all the presenters today, and I hadn't realised that Grace was going to sort of just skip off quite so soon, so please, Scott, could you pass on my huge thanks for Grace's contribution today. I know it was at the end of a very, very busy school day, so it's much appreciated, so please pass on our thanks. But thank you to all the presenters, and to you, Caroline, for hosting the Q&A and keeping an eye on the questions. I would just like to mention once again, I did last time, but for each of the principles, there are self-directed modules well worth having a look at. And really just for me to say a huge thank you to everybody on the call today, and because it is a very, very busy time, much appreciated, but I've certainly got a buzz from it, and I hope that we can, it's the start of a journey, as Jill said, it's the start of a journey, and it's the start of a journey for thriving lives in Scotland. So thank you to all of you. And you know, I said last week, I almost said safe journey home, but you're all at home. So safe move away from the screen, and have a lovely weekend when it comes to you, and have a lovely summer when it comes to you as well. So thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Bye.